Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we are meeting the author of this month's book, which is The Stationery Shop, and it's Marjan Kamali. We're so thrilled to have you with us today. And just before I pass it over to you, I'm just going to do a very quick introduction so that everybody kind of gets a little bit about your gets some more information about your background. So Marjan was born in Turkey to Iranian parents. She spent her childhood in Kenya, Germany, Turkey, Iran, and the United States. She studied English literature at UC Berkeley and received her MBA from Columbia University and her MFA from the New York University. She's the author of 2 novels, The Stationery Shop, which we've all read, and Together Tea, which I have not read yet, but I'm going to now. The Stationery Shop, a Boston global bestseller, was a Real Simple magazine top editorial's pick and an Indie Next pick, one of Newsweek's 30 best summer books, and an excerpt was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. It is being translated into several languages. Marjan's debut novel, Together Tea, was a Massachusetts Book Award finalist, an NPR WBUR Good Read, and a Target Emerging Author Selection, and has been translated into several languages as well, and adapted for the stage. Marjan's work has also been broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and published in 2 anthologies. She teaches writing at Grub Street and lives with her husband and 2 children in the Boston area. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know that I was saying to you before we welcomed our members today that your book, it was met with a lot of love. We love historical fiction, we love romance, so it kind of brought together the best of both worlds. Can you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your writing journey and career?
Sure. So thank you, Erin, for having me. This is kind of a treat and a great way to connect during these very strange times with COVID and all the isolation. So I'm thrilled that your book club members enjoyed the book. As you mentioned, I did grow up in very different countries. So I've lived in 5 continents, and the US is my 7th country. And growing up so much, I think, in different places and moving so much gave me kind of a different perspective, because when I moved to the US from Iran, everybody kept wondering how different it was and assuming that I was going through intense culture shock because I moved in the middle of 5th grade. And I remember even back then thinking, but it's not that different. And I really think that was the seed of my journey to becoming a writer. This knowledge that I felt I possessed about how at the end of the day, human dynamics and kind of our emotional cores are actually the same no matter where you go, whether I was in Kenya or Iran or Queens, New York. And I spent my childhood reading a ton. I was always reading. And kind of like now when we tell our children, put down the phone, you're gonna like ruin your eyes, you're gonna ruin your posture. People would tell me, enough with the books already, get your nose out of the book. But I was always reading. And it wasn't until high school that I even could imagine becoming a writer, because I was the child of immigrants. And as, a first-generation American, there was a lot of pressure for myself and my sister to pursue professions that were financially stable and that could create a great foundation here in the US for us. And writing just wasn't one of those. A good Persian girl would go to med school, maybe law school, engineering school. You didn't become a writer. So for a while, I pretended. I took Chem 1A in college and I tried to be pre-med. It just didn't work out. I applied to law school, but my heart was always in creative writing. And then finally, I think as I sort of evolved as a college student, I made the big break. I changed my major to English Lit. I wrote as an undergrad. And then later on, I I got an MFA in creative writing, though of course I also got the MBA, just kind of as a, I don't know, I had to do that to sort of appease certain elements culturally. And it was a detour laden route to becoming a writer, but I'm thrilled that I get to do what I love now.
So before I ask you another question, I just want to reiterate to everybody that is on here that you're welcome to ask questions live to Marjan if you like. There is a raise your hand functionality, and we also have a chat window. So if you have a burning question for our author tonight, please feel free to make that question known in one of those fashions. Back to what you were saying, it's all sounding very familiar. How much of your book is based on your own life?
Oh, well, the Stationery Shop is actually not really based on my own life. I got that over with the first book. So Together Tea, which is my first book, is semi-autobiographical. It's certainly not my life. I mean, it's fiction, but there are definite parallels. The main character in that book is in business school, but wants to be an artist. She leaves Iran at the same age I did. She goes back to Iran to visit at the same age I did. But with the Stationery Shop, I was really excited to go to a time period where I wasn't even born yet, and to sort of immerse myself in 1953 Iran, because I was shaped by the 1979 revolution in Iran as a child. But anytime my sister and I kept sort of becoming fixated on how that revolution turned our lives upside down, my parents would say, oh, you don't know anything about 1953. 1953 and the coup d'etat is when it all started. And so by placing my book in 1953, it forced me to do the research and to delve into that world and try and see what it was like to live in Iran then. And I also really, really wanted to have the book take place in New England when my two main characters are 77, because I didn't want to just be with them when they were young. I wanted to be with them after a lifetime of loss and not being together.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Okay, thank you. I understand that it's not autobiographical, but I see the parallels having having been born there and moved to the States as Roya did. Mr. And I apologize if I don't say his name right. Mr. Fakris.
Zachary, yeah, it's hard to say. Sometimes we call him Mr. F.
Okay. He's my favorite character by far. I want to know, do you have any more insight into that character, or can you tell us anything about him that we don't already know?
Yeah, you know, he was a really interesting character because in many ways we don't get into his point of view until the very end of the book, except for that one chapter when we meet him in 1916 when he's very young. So we're not with him a lot in the book, but he's so central to this story. And I wanted to explore what it's like to live a life where you're trying to do the best you can to compensate for a past regret or a past mistake. And I think Mr. F, if we call him that, Mr. Fahri, he's lived a good life by anybody's sort of social standards. He married the right woman. They had 4 children. He built this stationery shop, and he's helped so many young people by passing their love notes in between the pages of his books, fostering their relationships. He's also politically disseminating all this information within the city. But he has one weak spot, and that's Mrs. Aslan, and that's this young girl that he met when he was 18 and she was 14. and the repercussions of their interaction way back then, those ripple effects follow all the main characters of this book straight into, I would say, 2013. So I wanted to show what one man's weakness, soft spot, can do generations later, the damage that can be done.
It's so crazy to me because literally their lives would have gone on such different trajectories had they both been in the right square that day.
Exactly. Everything would have been different. Everything for those two would have been different just based on that one afternoon.
And that in that instance, it's so obvious too that is the case. But I wonder in our own lives how many times we change the course of our lives just by happenstance.
I agree. I think there's so many times, and sometimes when you hear people's love stories, if you say, "Oh, how did you meet?" and then people will say, I was supposed to be taking this train from Grand Central, but I missed it, so I took this train, and then I met this guy." Think the tiniest things can alter the course of a lifetime, and that's why I wanted to include that Persian expression, which is that your fate is written in invisible ink on your forehead the day that you're born. Sometimes I think it's so overwhelming to think of how these tiny twists of fate can alter everything, that you have to fall back on this belief that it was predetermined, because otherwise you can maybe drive yourself a little nuts.
Thank you for that. Jennifer's got a very good question, and I knew we were going to get into this tonight, so let's let's go there. So Mrs. Aslan, she said she was very conflicted by her because she seems to be the villain, but you really give context for why she is the way she is, but she's still conflicted about a mentally ill villain. How did you choose to give her a mental illness that she uses as a threat, or uses a threat in the story?
That is a great question. Mrs. Aslan started out as just a villain. She was the archetype of the mean mother-in-law figure, even though she was never quite Roya's mother-in-law, but she was very much just mean and nasty. Except as I wrote her in that first draft, as her backstory developed and as her character bubbled up, I realized that I didn't want to just write a straight up villain. That's not interesting. I kind of believe that most people are not straight up good or bad. And if they are, then they're not that interesting to me. So her mental illness is the kind that's triggered by a traumatic experience and is worsened by ensuing trauma. But also, I wanted to show the kind of mental illness that's not recognized or treated, because I really think mental illness is on a spectrum. They're the people who are easily diagnosed and treated. Everybody knows they have a condition. That's how they're known within their circles. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people who are high functioning, who, are not diagnosed. They're certainly not treated. They do have a mood disorder. They do have an actual condition that ends up harming themselves and those around them. So the tragedy really is that Mrs. Aslan, it's not in her hands. I don't believe her mental illness is in her hands, but it causes great damage. And I think that's the tragedy, that so much of the pain and the loss that Roy and Bahman experience was triggered by something that could have been treated or at least diagnosed.
Personally, I thought she might have more sympathy for them, or actually encouragement, because of her own experience, that they couldn't get married in the end, and that, but I guess she was, we talk about the mental illness aspect, but also it sounded like she was angry at him still, or go ahead.
I think it works both ways. On the one hand, I've seen people who have suffered a certain wrong, and then they go about their lives trying to make sure other people don't suffer that wrong, which is what you would hope Mrs. Aslan would do. Maybe say, I didn't get to be with my first love. I see how painful, that was for me. So I will give my son that gift. But she's of the other mindset. There are just as many people I have seen, sadly, who have suffered a wrong and who feel, well, I went through it. And, maybe they should too. And when it comes to her son, I really think she thinks she's doing the best for him. I don't for a minute believe that Mrs. Aslan thinks she's hurting Bahman by keeping him away from Roya. She thinks she's helping him by having him marry into this richer, more stable family, which is Shahlah's family. And again, that's the tragedy of parenting, right? Where with the best of intentions, wanting to protect your child, hoping that this is actually better for them, you end up messing things up.
I was actually quite dismayed that he ended up marrying her, because I understand it didn't work out with him and Roya, but the fact that he was like, oh, okay, well, it didn't work out, so I guess I'll just marry this lady my mom wants me to marry. I thought that was unfortunate, but
Yeah, I think he gave up pretty.
yeah.
He was so destitute and upset that he just kind of checked out for a while.
So do you have any other plans for these characters? Will we see them again, or do we have to say goodbye to them?
Great question. People have talked about a sequel, and people talked about a sequel with Together Tea with my first book. And to be honest with you, I could have written that sequel with a blindfold on. I knew those characters so well. And after the Stationery Shop, they were with me for so long, it would have been easier to write a sequel. But I like to leave them where they are. I feel they've been through a lot and have come to a sense of healing, we hope. And so far you won't see a sequel. But who knows? Let's see. You may see them in a different format. And that's all I'm allowed to say about that.
Okay, that's very interesting. I always find it very interesting how the authors connect with their characters, and when some authors say that they're actually like so upset when they finish their book because it's like the end. Did you have any experience like that?
Yes, I'm actually really happy to hear you say that, because then it means it's not just me. When I finished the book, I was completely drained. That last chapter, after I finished the last sentence, I was literally shaking in this room. But yeah, it's really hard to let them go. On the one hand, you're happy, there's a sense of relief, you've gone through this whole journey with them, but you do get attached, or at least I get attached. And it's hard to start a new book when you're still hanging on to the old characters. So it took a while for me to just kind of decompress and do a reset so that I could start developing new characters for a new book. Bahman, Roya, Mrs. Aslan, and Mr. Fakhri were kind of embedded in my psyche. And I'll tell you a secret to kind of get over that intense attachment. My agent recommended that I write each one of them a letter. And yeah, I know, at the risk of making all of you think that I'm a little crazy, but I did write each one of those 4 characters a letter and just kind of let them go. And it was only then that I could really move on.
I don't think that this is crazy at all, because I know that even reading a book, I feel like this. So I can't even imagine, and how long did it take you to write this book?
Yeah, that's the other thing, right? Because when you're reading it, I know people have said it takes them a while. They're with them for a while after they finish. It takes them a while to get over them too. But you may read it in let's say a couple of days, maybe a week, maybe a few weeks at most. But they were, the first draft took me 2.5 years, and then I revised for an additional year. So that's 3.5. But then once you sign the book deal and you're in production, then there's editorial notes, and that's like going into production, all the other things that are going on. You're with them another year. So yeah, they become real. They're very real to me. I mean, I think of them as real people, even though I made them up.
Can we just discuss Walter for a minute? Because when I started reading this, I was very concerned for Walter because he is such a good man. And I knew that obviously because of the way that it had started, that she was going to meet the true love of her life again at the end. And the whole time I was like on tender hooks wondering what was going to happen to Walter.
Thank you for saying that, because I have strong feelings about Walter. I visited book clubs where people have been Team Walter versus Team Bahman. And, you know, some readers think that Walter was second best for Roya, or that Walter was a compromise. And at this point, any reader has just as much right to their interpretation as I do, because the book is out there. But personally, that's not how I see Walter. I think of Walter as, like you said, an incredible man, a big man with this generous spirit, because he gives her the gift of having her address this unfinished business. And it's not like she needed his permission. She could have driven down to the Duxton Center with or without him, with or without telling him. But the fact that he gives her his support enables her to just do what she needs to do to kind of unravel what happened. And he gives her that freedom to reconnect with Bahman, to figure things out, to sort of go through what I consider a healing. And it takes a huge man to do that, a very secure man. I don't know if Walter would have done it when they were 37, but he sure does do it when they're 77. And I adore Walter. I do not see him as a compromise. She loved Bahman. She loves Walter. I really think you can love more than two people romantically. It doesn't mean you're, doing an injustice to one or the other. I believe you can hold both in your heart.
I think that the way that you wrote it really, like, it was so well done because she had just come off that breakup and then moved to the States, and so much turmoil in her life. I don't think we would have believed it had it been anybody else other than Walter.
I like to hear that.
Mm.
Yeah. Walter's Walter. Yeah. And I agree with you. If she had met somebody a bit more rambunctious, or
Like Jack.
like Jack would not have worked out for Roya one bit. Yeah, only Walter would have fit the bill at that point in her life. I agree with you.
Sorry, Jennifer, I'm not ignoring you. Jennifer's asked a question a little while ago. She wants to know why Bahman opened a stationery shop even after he learned what Mr. F did.
That's a good question. I always saw his opening the stationery shop as kind of an homage to a period of time in their lives, his and Roya's, like a moment in time. The fact that the stationery shop burnt down, the fact that it got destroyed on a day where the country was, in many people's minds, destroyed, I think made the stationery shop, the original one in Tehran, even more symbolic. And maybe he was trying to recreate some of his youth. Maybe he was trying to preserve some of Tehran in a way here in New England. I don't know if he associated it with Mr. F as much as with that atmosphere that preceded the coup d'etat, this kind of magical moment in his own life and also in the city's, in the city's period of blossoming with all this literature and theater and art and cinema. It was a very special time, and then it all just kind of fell apart.
You'll have to excuse my ignorance. I don't know enough about the history, but in Tehran in 1953 did you write based on sort of what the actual political upheaval was?
I sure tried. I really tried. I knew that I would have readers who knew not one thing about what happened in 1953 in Iran, but I also knew I would have readers who lived it. And, my parents, for example. And so I was very careful. I did a lot of research. I read nonfiction books about the coup d'etat in 1953. I read anecdotes in old newspapers. I looked up as much as I could. There's a timeline now down to the hour that you can see online of what happened in Tehran that day. But I was also in this special position of privilege where I could pick up the phone and actually interview people in my own family who'd lived through it. So I tried to do my due diligence when it came to the actual events. And politically to this day, people will disagree about whose fault it was, but the political facts that are there, Simon and Schuster fact-checked everything, just so we would be able to have that authority of not, you don't want your reader to get out of the fictional dream because something seems unbelievable. So to the best of my knowledge, I tried to recreate the political realities the way that they actually were. I didn't make that stuff up.
Do you go back to visit, or did you go to visit for the book?
Well, I went for my first book, I visited, and I went twice in my 20s, twice in my 30s. I haven't been back now for about 9 years. So those visits that I had were really incredible, and especially because I got to reunify with my extended family, some of whom were still there. I haven't been back recently though. To recreate 1953, I bugged my dad a heck of a lot. He spent hours talking to me, and I tried to draw out all the details from him. And he was very generous, He wanted me to know exactly what kinds of pastries they were eating in the cafes. He was very specific. Elephant ear pastries, tongue-shaped pastries, not that pastry, that wouldn't have been there. The coffee that they were drinking, the music they were listening to. He told me about the waltzes and the tangos in the young people's parties. And he shared with me what people were wearing and what was playing at Cinema Metropole. I took copious notes, and I kind of just inhaled all this information, because I think sometimes when we write, what we're really trying to do is capture a time or a place that feels like it's slipping away. And it was my way of capturing not even anything to do with my own experience, but something to do with his.
I feel like that's such a gift to spend the time with your father and talk about his history, because I feel like we don't do enough of that.
It's so true. And honestly, it was an excuse to do that. Because if I were to speak to him day to day, this stuff would never come up. Be like, oh, how are you? I'm good. Here's your mom. This stuff would never come up. It was a great excuse to have a reason to have him share more.
Can we talk about the cover of your book for a minute?
Yeah.
So there's actually two covers.
Yeah.
They're equally as beautiful. How was that process for you?
You know, it was really interesting. When the first cover came out, it looked nothing like this. It was entirely different. And at that time, we only had two blurbs, you know, the little
Mhm.
praise paragraphs at the back of the book. We had two of them. And I think what happened is people in the department looked at the blurbs, looked at the cover, and maybe felt it didn't match. So they literally went back to the drawing board and they said, we need to rethink this whole cover. The other cover was very bland. And there were these weeks where we had no cover. And I remember thinking, I'm sure they'll come up with one. And then they came up with the hard cover, which was this.
Yeah, that is the one I love.
I know,
So,
and it's so beautiful, and it's got like the shiny tinfoil thing. I couldn't believe it when it came out. So gorgeous. And then when we were going to paperback, they said we're going to do a new cover. And I kept saying, no, don't. It's so good. Everybody loves the cover. People keep private messaging me saying I bought the book because of the cover. And they love the cover. And they said, no, we need to do something different for the paperback. And then they did this, which is also beautiful. And it's very different. You know, it's got the silhouettes of the young couple, and there's more of the city. And then I don't know if you know this, but in the UK, it's got a different title and a different cover. So this is the UK version.
Mhm.
So it's interesting. It's interesting how all of that comes about. But I feel I was so lucky with the art department's great care with this cover.
I haven't read Together Tea yet. There's the yet. But is it a romance novel as well?
Yeah, it is. It's more a mother-daughter story. But of course, there's romance in there because I can't help myself.
Mhm.
She ends up, you know, meeting the love of her life, or at least for that time period. Um, it's a mother-daughter story, and it's about a family who leaves Iran right after the 1979 revolution and the early days of the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s, and they come to the US. And it's told from the point of view of the daughter, Mina. So we're with her when she's 25, and we go back to when she's a kid and back again to when she's 25. And the mother, Daria, and the mother's a piece of work. So I had a lot of fun with that character.
Well, I can't wait to read it now. I just need to find some time.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of times when we're having conversations with our authors, they've written the book. It sounds like you have a creative writing background and you love to write. But was there anything that really stood out to you while writing the book that you really wanted to impart on your readers?
Yeah, you know, as I was writing this book, there's certain refrains that go through your mind, I feel, for each book. With Together Tea, this phrase that kept going through my mind was, what's done cannot be undone. And it became like a theme in the book, and I mentioned it a few times. But with the Stationery Shop, this refrain that I kept hearing in my head was, time is not linear. And I remember thinking, I want to impart this belief that time is not linear. And it affected how I approached the book, because we open when Roya is 77. And the book opens when she goes to the Duxton Center to see Bahman for the first time in 60 years. And the minute she sees him, she's also 17. And I wanted to impart that notion that at any given moment in time, we're all the ages we've ever been and maybe will be. So, you know, right now I'm talking to you from my home office, but I'm also the 10-year-old girl who came to the US from Iran. I'm also maybe, hopefully, the older woman I will one day be. I don't believe that any of that goes away. And I think it's kind of like the Russian dolls where all those experiences are with us. And all it takes is a trigger, one scent, his voice, and she's back there. And that's something I was trying to impart, which is not easy to even explain as I'm sitting here. And it was something I was trying to have come through Roya's journey in the book.
I totally get that. And I think it did come through for sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
I feel like that myself sometimes. I feel like when I answer the door and there's a teenager at the door and I'm like, what do they see? Because I don't feel like this middle-aged woman. I still feel like a teenager.
I know. It's just incredible. And also depending on who you're with, right? Like if I'm talking to my sister, I sound like I'm 12. And if I'm talking to someone else, I'll sound different. You know, it's really weird. I do feel you can access all those different stages at the drop of a pin.
For sure. So Sharon wants to know what you're working on next. And I actually want to know if it's going to be based in Tehran.
Yes, both great questions. So I'll answer yours first, Erin. Yes, it is going to be based partially in Tehran. So when I was writing The Stationery Shop, it was the second book I had written that was taking place in two countries, the US and Iran, and also had a dual timeline. And I remember saying to myself, I will never do this again. My next book is going to take place in one room, in one day. I'm so tired of straddling these cultures and these timelines. So of course my third book is going to take place in two countries and also has not just a dual timeline, but like way different decades going on. I can't seem to stop, and I decided to just embrace it.
Yeah, you don't need to stop. It's working for you.
Okay, good. Because sometimes my mom will say, don't you think people are tired about you writing about Iran? Like, can you just write about Australia? And I'll say, Mom, they seem to be interested. And I'm interested. There's so much I still want to explore. It's also very fascinating for me to write about Iran because technically I'm Iranian. I have this heritage, and yet I didn't really live there. It's always been a mystery to me, this place of contradictions where my parents have one set of memories that seem glamorous and magical, and then you turn on the news and it's this whole other image that you get. So I think there's a lot there, but to answer the question, it's going to take place in the 1960s, Iran, and also in the US, of course. And I'm really exploring the women's movement. To my surprise, people don't know that there was and is a robust women's movement in Iran with a really strong history. So yeah, I'm in very early stages, unfortunately.
Not that I'm anybody to offer you advice, but
No, please do. Please do.
I absolutely think that you need to continue. I don't think you should listen to your mother.
Okay, thank you. Because I have to keep explaining why I'm doing it, but thank you. Go ahead.
There's not enough written about Australia either, I will say that, but there are some countries that have an influx or over like very plentiful historical fiction. A lot of European countries, but this is not one of them. And this is not European either, but Iran is absolutely somewhere that, like, that was part of the joy of reading the book, is that like we were exploring a country that we knew very, very little about. At least, and I don't want to speak for everybody because I'm sure that's not the case for everybody, but that was my experience for sure.
Yeah, and you know what? I appreciate your advice. I'm gonna take it because I keep having to say to my mom, it's not like the people who read it are just Iranians. They're people, and she's like, really? They care? I'm like, it's a book, you know. It's the emotions are hopefully universal. So okay, thank you for saying that. And I'll stop when it's not interesting to me to write about it. But as long as it's interesting to me, I think I should stay there.
Well, that's got to be some of your gift. If you're pursuing something that's really interesting to yourself, then I mean, obviously, magic comes from that.
Yeah, I think that's the secret, right? To any art that you pursue. Don't do it if it's not challenging or interesting to you, because then it won't be for the reader or for the person receiving it.
Nora has a very good question here. She says, food was a big part of your story. It was like another character. Why did you incorporate it so much in the story? And she also wants you to know that she loved it.
Oh, thank you, Nora. I included food because I love food. I love all food. In another life, I swear I would have been a chef. I just love to cook, all kinds of food, but especially Persian food. It is my biggest link to the culture, to be quite honest, because it's the one thing I do know really well about the culture. And in my first book, I included a lot of food, and people kept saying, "Oh, you included a lot of food. Why did you do that?" And I said, "Oh, did I?" Because I didn't intend to. But in the stationery shop, it was intentional. It was completely intentional. Um, when Roya cooks for Walter that dish during their first real date, it's her way of communicating with him. And she doesn't even speak English that well yet. But through the cooking and the eating, they connect. And throughout the book, I wanted to show that food helps people connect, brings them together, also connects them not just to one another, but to the past. And I see that with so many of my friends, no matter their cultural background, they'll say, this is how I connect, you know, whether they're first generation, second generation, third generation, they say, this is how I connect to the culture. Yeah, maybe I should just write a cookbook, because it's really hard for me to write a novel without including a ton of food in it. So sometimes I actually have to take the food out so it's not too much.
I don't know if anybody else did this, but I Googled Persian restaurants after the fact.
I've heard that a lot, and I get a lot of emails for recipes.
Yeah, I can imagine that as well, for sure. It's almost like it should be included in the back. It's like that would be a nice.
I know. At this point, like, I have a list of all the links to all the food bloggers, and I send it to people, because also I've heard people make that dish now for their first dates.
Aw.
Yeah, it's really fun. The food is a lot of fun for me. I find it fun.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. If anybody else has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window, or you can ask them live if you like. I want to change gears a little bit and just talk to you. A lot of the authors we speak to are big readers as well. I imagine you are looking at your bookshelf behind you. Who influences you the most, or what has influenced your writing?
It's a great question. When I was a kid and I was reading a lot, I did read children's books, but that period of time between age 9 and 10, when we lived in Iran, I feel formed so much of my future writing and reading, because we didn't have access to English language books. They closed all those bookshops down after the revolution. So I only had what my mother already had in her stash, and she had all the classics. So I read Dickens and the Bronte sisters and all this stuff. We didn't know what YA was, middle grade. I just read all the adult books. And that, I think, affected me. And then when we were in the US and I was growing up, two writers that really influenced me were Toni Morrison and Gabrielle Garcia Marquez. Both of them felt like a discovery when I first read their work, because I didn't know you could do that. I was like, oh, you're allowed to do that? You're allowed to do that in a book? And it was really liberating to read them. But I read a wide variety. I am not, like a book snob. Give me a cozy mystery, give me a classic, give me Anna Karenina, give me just a fun, light read. It's like food. Sometimes you want French onion soup. Sometimes, you just want some popcorn. I like a variety.
I feel like so many of us stick to our genres, and I hear one thing about the book club and it's about connecting with other women, but the second thing I hear is about books that get people out of their genres because they get stuck in them. So it's always delightful to hear somebody tell me, oh my gosh, I love that book, and it's not something I would have ever picked up on my own.
Yeah, that's what's so lovely about book clubs, right? You expand your reading diet, things you never would have touched maybe, but then you like it. So yeah.
So Katie, this is going to be the last question I ask, although maybe I'll have to ask another because I don't know that we can end on such a sad note. But Katie would like to know, and I have two small children, so this was very hard for me to read this part of the book, but she was surprised when Roya and Walter ended up having another child after the death of Marigold. I love the name Marigold. I think if I had have read this like a year earlier, I might have a child right now named Marigold.
Wow.
After the death of Marigold, as that was such a heartbreaking moment for Roya, what made you make that decision?
Okay, so I have been asked this question before, and I'm going to answer it honestly. I didn't plan on that happening. I remember where I wrote certain chapters for the first time, and the Marigold chapter, I was sitting on my couch in the living room behind me, and I remember sitting down thinking, this is the chapter where Roya will have a baby. And she was not going to die in my mind when I started. And then she did. She died on me. It was very sad for me as a writer. I remember just sitting there thinking, okay, what was that? And then I took a breath and I said, there's a reason it came out that way. Maybe my subconscious was trying to tell me something. And I ended up keeping it that way. I always knew there would be a Kyle. That was part of the plan. In fact, in an earlier draft, there was a whole Kyle chapter really early on in the book where he comes home for dinner and sees his dad, Walter, and his mom, Roya, right before Roya goes to Duxton. So Marigold surprised me. And it was one of those things where it happened as it did on the page, and I chose to keep it. But it was sad for me too. I cried so much writing this book. It was just nuts. I used so many tissues writing this book.
Ironically, while you were explaining that, I had the exact same question come to my mind that Jennifer has just asked. Because I thought I was crazy, and clearly I'm not, because everybody's chiming in now saying that they thought this as well. They thought that Kyle and Claire might end up together.
Yes, so one of my favorite topics. So again, the disclaimer is at this point, whatever you believe is just as valid as what I believe, because the book is out there. But if you want to know what I believe, I truly need for Kyle and Claire to get together. I would love that. I want Claire to be part of Roy's life. I want Kyle and Claire to just be together forever if possible. I didn't tie it up with a neat bow because if you want to believe that they drive off in their separate cars and never see each other again, you may believe that. Or if you want to believe like I do, that they get together, you may believe that. But yes, I'm really on the team of Kyle and Claire together forever.
I believe they got together because there was so much building of her character. So I thought that she became important, and I thought that there must be a reason for that.
Yeah, there is a reason. Why did she get so many pages? She got her very own chapter, so yes. Yes.
Okay, so Melissa is going to ask a question live, which is very exciting for me. And this is going to end our interview as well. So Melissa, you're live.
Hello. I love the book. Thank you so much for writing it. I was going to ask the Claire and Kyle question, but I was going to go also back to the food. I think the food is really important. And my view of when they had the first date where she cooked for him in the house where she was living, it was kind of like a test. if he liked it, would he be the right man? If he said, oh, it's okay, but next time can we go out for burgers? She would know something about him. I had that expectation that it was meaningful.
I agree with you, Melissa. I agree with you. I feel Roya, being Roya, if he had shunned it or faked his liking of it, or like you said, if it was a lukewarm reaction, I don't know if she could have been with him. Because it was more than about the food, right? It was about, do you accept me? Very symbolic.
Yes.
Exactly. The food signified kind of her culture. Are you willing to try this thing with which you're completely unfamiliar? So I agree with you. It was a bit of a test. Yeah.
Yeah. I find it very timely because my son is engaged to an Iranian woman and she still lives at home. So my son spends a lot of time with her mom and the cooking. And he said to his potential mother-in-law, it's like, teach me how to cook your food. And she's like, oh my God, I've always wanted to teach my daughters and they have no interest. Yes, I would love to teach you Persian cooking.
Oh my God, touchdown. He said the right thing. Yeah, I bet she was delighted.
And he made some last night. And I was like, yum, yum, yum.
Oh, do you know what he made?
Oof, it was meat and onions and it was over rice. It was tomatoes and not cumin. What's the other one?
Cardamom.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Awesome.
Incredible.
He's doing the right thing. Let's just put it that way. I'm excited. I'm excited for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's so much kind of wrapped up in that food situation. It's hugely symbolic.
And it often in books, it keeps the women in the kitchen talking or not talking. You get a lot happening when food is prepared in a book.
Very true. Very true. Like there's a scene where Roya and her mother are preparing food, as she's looking ahead to becoming married and leaving the home. And there's almost like this nostalgic sense of, I'll miss this. I'll miss these days just being in the same kitchen with my mom as a day-to-day thing. Yeah, there's so much that is involved with it. And I know growing up, for me, that's where I heard all the good stories in the kitchen.
And then you put it in with the sister-in-law. Patricia was her name. She's the cold sister-in-law. And all of a sudden, she came in with all that stuff for that was beautiful.
Yeah, that's another scene where I've had grown men tell me they were sobbing. The Patricia scene, she did redeem herself, didn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the New Year's ingredients. Oh, I remember writing that scene too. It's so weird. I get a little nostalgic for these characters. But Erin said it's okay, so that's good.
It is okay.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure it has been speaking with you tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed our chat. And we are on tenterhooks waiting for your next book. So I know you're in early stages, but please hurry.
I will hurry. I'll hurry. You saw it here first. I start by hand. So here we go. Here's my notebook with my stickers like a child on it. So I will work hard so I can visit your book club again. How about that?
Absolutely. Let us know when it's coming out for sure.
I will.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.